10, which is the election of 1920. Where are most of our presidential candidates coming from? What state? Ohio. It's incredible. Yeah. So, in the election of 1920, the Republicans nominated Warren G. Harding for president. Remember, Wilson's health wasn't good, was it? After World War I, he struggled to get the League of Nations, and I told you that Wilson's health got so bad that he had what? Do you remember? Stroke, and who really ran the presidency at the end? His wife. Yeah. So Wilson was not a factor in 1920. The Republicans nominated Warren G. Harding, which was actually the opposite party, during this election. The Democrats are going to nominate Ohio Governor James M. Cox for the presidency. So in this election, it'll be the Republican candidate Warren G. Harding versus the Democratic candidate Ohio Governor James M. Cox. I'll tell you a little bit about Harding. He owned a newspaper in Ohio. Good thing to do if you're in politics is own the newspaper, right? He had once served in the United States Senate. He was considered a very easygoing man. So he owned his own newspaper. He had served in the United States Senate. Was considered a very easygoing man. Was a pretty popular political figure in his home state of Ohio. And guess who his running mate's going to be? Come on, impress me today. Very good. Massachusetts Governor Calvin Coolidge. Because of his actions as governor during the Boston police strike and the political clout he received because of that, he's going to run as Harding's running mate. Massachusetts Governor Calvin Coolidge. Now the Democratic Party's got a big name too for the vice presidency. Who's going to run for the vice presidency with James M. Cox? Franklin Delano Roosevelt is going to run for the vice presidency. So you have the Battle of the Ohioans here, right? Are both candidates from Ohio? Certainly are. And you'd think maybe that Ohio Governor James M. Cox would have the advantage because he's in a high political office as governor. Harding served in the Senate but wasn't active at the time. Cox had a newcomer by the name of Franklin D. Roosevelt for the vice presidency. However, Harding had the pretty popular Calvin Coolidge. Pretty good race. Well, in the end, Harding wins in a pretty decisive manner. He had 404 electoral votes. Cox had 127 is all. And with his victory, Warren G. Harding becomes the nation's 29th president of the United States. So Harding wins the Battle of the Ohioans. He defeats Cox 404 electoral votes to 127, and Warren G. Harding becomes the nation's 29th president of the United States, and Massachusetts Governor Calvin Coolidge now assumes the vice presidency. Okay? All right, now we're going to get into a little Wyoming history here. Public scandals during the Harding administration. Let's see if we might get into Soraya a little bit here and see if she remembers something. Now, if you sum up the Harding administration, there were some solid accomplishments. However, his administration left a long, sorry record of scandals. And really, Harding wasn't involved in these scandals himself. He picked bad cabinet members who got him in trouble. So although he was not involved in these scandals himself, he took responsibility for them in history, but certain members of his cabinet were not good. Now, I could tell you all kinds of different scandals that went on, but the one I'm going to talk about the most, and the only one I'm talking about, which was very famous, was known as the Teapot Dome scandal. Teapot Dome scandal. Anybody know what Teapot Dome was? It was a naval oil reserve. Where was it located? Wyoming. No, located in Wyoming. So this scandal, most famous scandal of the Harding administration was the Teapot Dome scandal. It took place at the Naval Oil Reserve, which was located at Teapot Dome in Wyoming. And there were 2 members of Harding's cabinet that were involved in this scandal, got him in trouble. First one was the Secretary of the Interior, a fellow by the name of Albert Fall. Albert Fall. The second member of Harding's cabinet that got him in trouble at Teapot Dome was the Secretary of the Navy, Edwin Denby. So the 2 cabinet members of Harding's administration that were involved in the Teapot Dome scandal were Secretary of the Interior Albert Fall and Secretary of the Navy Edwin Denby. Now this might be a little difficult to understand, so we'll kind of try to simplify it. Who has control of the Teapot Dome oil reserves of these 2 men? Who has control of them? Who controls? Edwin Denby, very good. So Secretary of the Navy Edwin Denby controls the jurisdiction of the Teapot Dome oil reserves. He's the man that makes the decisions. And what happened is the Secretary of the Interior, Albert Fall, talked Secretary of the Navy, Denby, to transfer the Teapot Dome oil reserve to his jurisdiction. So if that happens, who now controls this oil reserve? Come on. Albert Fall, the Secretary of the Interior. So, Secretary of the Interior Albert Fall persuades Secretary of the Navy Edwin Denby to give him jurisdiction over the Teapot Dome oil reserves. Well, what Fall does is he then leases these oil reserves to private oil speculators. Fall leases these naval oil reserves to private oil speculators. What's lease mean? He rents them. Yeah, okay. Who do you think took the money? Fall. So Fall leased these naval oil reserves to private oil speculators and kept the money himself. That's illegal and results in a scandal. Well, in 1923, this scandal becomes public. It becomes public knowledge that Fall is skimming off the top. He's leasing these naval oil reserves at a profit for himself. Who do you think else might be getting a buck or 2 off this deal? Edwin Denby. Very good. And when that's discovered, both were prosecuted and both were sent to prison. Both were prosecuted and sent to prison. That instance was known as the Teapot Dome scandal. And it was one of many that President Harding had. Well, because of all the pressure of his health, President Harding dies in the summer of 1923 of a heart attack. So as a result, President Harding health breaks under all the pressures of these scandals, and he suddenly dies in the summer of 1923 of a heart attack. Who then becomes our nation's 30th president? Calvin Coolidge. All right. Well, there's not much else to tell you about the Harding administration other than the fact he had a lot of scandal and Coolidge finished it out. So we'll finish up today with the election of 1924 and tell you what happened next. Election of 1924. When I get done with this, I'm going to let Soraya give you a little perspective on the AP history exam. Okay? All right. Now, who do you think the Republicans nominated for president in 1924? Seemed like it'd be a pretty simple choice. Calvin Coolidge. Now, some members of the Republican Party didn't like that. Didn't think he was the guy. So what happens when that happens? They split, and a new party comes about called the Progressive Party. So, Coolidge is nominated by the Republican Party, not for re-election, right? Because he wasn't ever elected, he assumed the presidency. And there were members of the Republican Party that didn't care much for that. And what did they do? They split off and formed their own party called the Progressive Party. And they nominated a senator from Wisconsin by the name of Robert La Follette. Robert La Follette became the candidate for the Progressive Party. So the Republicans are split. Coolidge for the Republican Party, Robert La Follette for the Progressive Party, which were part of the Republican Party. He was a senator from Wisconsin. Now, campaign slogans came back, and because Republican supporters believed Coolidge was cool under pressure of everyday politics, the Republican slogan for this election was, "Keep cool with Coolidge." Yeah. That would automatically get your vote, wouldn't it? Keep cool with Coolidge. Well, who's smiling pretty much right now? Who's thinking this is great?
Democrats.
Democrats. And they nominate a fellow by the name of John W. Davis. And he was simply a conservative lawyer at the time of his nomination. John W. Davis. Who's the advantage to here? Every time you'd think. The party that doesn't split. Right, and that was the Democrats. Well, ironically, Coolidge went on to defeat those two counterparts. He had 382 electoral votes. Davis, the Democratic nominee, had 136, and La Follette from the Progressive Party actually received 13. So it was a big victory for Calvin Coolidge. He wins 382 to 136 for Davis to 13 by La Follette. Okay, that'll be it. Tomorrow we'll start with the election of 1928. And I'll let Soraya doesn't mind, let her come up and talk to you a little bit about that. Just come up and tell a little bit about it. Okay, they'd probably like to know. So, now what I want Soraya to do is kind of explain the test, how she thought she did, some of the questions, etc., the format, and what she might have done better to prepare.